President Cyril Ramaphosa's government in South Africa is facing a fierce debate over an age-old problem: land. Specifically, who owns it and who doesn't. That issue is an open wound in the country's post-apartheid era. On the left, there are calls for the government to seize land held by white South Africans, putting serious pressure on President Ramaphosa's government. For white farmers, these calls for expropriation without compensation are familiar. They evoke the violence of government-mandated seizures of white-owned farms in neighboring Zimbabwe nearly 2 decades ago under Robert Mugabe. And for many, the debate stirs up fears that South Africa could fall to economic devastation like its neighbor to the north. Emotions about land reform run high and misinformation abounds. But here are the facts. Expropriation without compensation has happened before in South Africa. In 1913, the government passed the Natives Land Act. Back then, it grabbed 87% of arable land for whites and corralled black South Africans onto reserves where they had no individual ownership rights. Black livelihoods were destroyed. Today, not enough has changed. Of all the agricultural land owned by individuals across the country, 72% is owned by whites, who make up just 9% of the population. 4% of that land is owned by black South Africans, who make up 79% of the population. Nelson Mandela pledged that 30% of South African land held by whites would be distributed to poor black citizens after apartheid. But progress is painfully slow. It's not hard to see why. Land reform is disruptive in a Robin Hood sort of way. As The Economist notes, it involves the government grabbing land from the relatively well-off and doling it out to the poor. This often involves a fight. Take China. In 1949, after the Communist Revolution, the government began grabbing land from landlords who were the victims of brutal violence. Almost half the country's arable land was distributed to 300 million people. The violence was horrific, but the reform had immediate effects. According to The Economist, grain output soared by as much as 70% in the decade following 1945. But revolution isn't always bloody. For instance, South Korea in the 1950s peacefully bought up private farms and distributed the land to tillers, minting 1.6 million small landowners. Taiwan also benefited from reforms around the same time. Scholars have often noted that good land reform policies help build a middle class that then helps democracy flourish. But let's return to Africa, specifically Zimbabwe. Robert Mugabe allowed unconscionable violence against white landowners. He doled out land to cronies, which caused deep economic suffering. The dominant narrative was that it was an unmitigated disaster. But as Ben Cousins of the University of the Western Cape points out, the legacy of Zimbabwean land reform is more complex than the dominant narrative, particularly when you consider the case of tobacco farmers. As the New York Times reported, when 2,000 mostly white tobacco farmers were forced from their land, tens of thousands of mostly black farmers took their place. At first, production ebbed, but it rose impressively in later years, creating livelihoods for the once landless. In the end, the case for land reform in South Africa is not merely a moral one. Properly and sensibly executed, land reform is also good economics and good politics.